Lord Edvard Voss watched from the upper gallery of Thornmere Hall as the new governess picked the lock on the east wing door with a hairpin, a candle balanced in her other hand, a book of children's stories tucked under her arm, and he recognized her at once, which was the problem, because he had spent 11 years hoping he would not. She had changed. Of course she had. The daughter of Baron Cresswell, who had once worn silk at the Viennese embassy and argued about Schopenhauer with foreign ministers, now wore a governess's plain gray dress with a darned cuff. But the way she moved, precise, unhurried, unapologetic, that had not changed at all. Nor had the particular angle of her chin when she was doing something she knew perfectly well she was not supposed to do. The lock gave. Miss Isolde Cresswell, formerly Lady Isolde, before her father's spectacular financial ruin and the scandal that followed, pushed open the door to the east wing, without flinching, stepped inside, and began to read aloud to the darkness. Oh. Every servant at Thornmere Hall feared the east wing. They had feared it for as long as anyone could remember, and the reasons they gave varied. Strange sounds at odd hours, a cold that persisted regardless of season, a sensation of being watched by something that did not breathe. The previous 3 governesses had refused to go near it. The one before that had given notice the morning after she'd been asked to deliver a supper tray to the corridor outside the locked door at the wing's far end. Isolde Cresswell had been at Thornmere Hall for 4 days. On the first day, she had catalogued every room in the house she was permitted to enter and made note of the one she was not. On the second day, she had asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Parfit, why the east wing was sealed. Mrs. Parfit had gone pale and changed the subject. On the third day, Isolde had observed that the dust on the east wing corridor floor showed a single set of footprints, large going in and not coming out, and that fresh candles had been placed in the sconces within the last week by someone who did not leave by the servants' staircase. On the fourth day, she had picked the lock. She read from a volume of Grimm's Tales, her voice steady and clear, the candle throwing warm light across the corridor's faded wallpaper. She did not know, or did not appear to know, that the door at the far end of the corridor was not locked, that it stood open by a 1/4 inch, that the occupant of the room beyond had gone very still the moment her voice reached him. Edvard had not heard a human voice read aloud to him since 1743. He pressed his back against the wall beside the door and closed his eyes. The voice was doing something to the cold that lived in his chest, not warming it exactly, but acknowledging it, the way a hand laid against a window acknowledges the weather outside without pretending to change it. He stayed there until she finished the story, until the candle's light retreated down the corridor, until the east wing door closed behind her. Then he stood in the dark for a very long time, thinking about a problem he had not anticipated. Isolde Cresswell knew something he needed, and she was the last person in England he could afford to let know it. The problem was this: Edvard Voss was dying. Not in the way that humans died, not quickly, not with fever or failing lungs, but in the slow, particular way that ancient vampires died when the curse that sustained them began to unravel. He had felt it beginning 3 years ago, a gradual dimming, like a lamp whose oil was not replenished. He had consulted every source available to him: the records of the Voss family archive, the correspondence of 2 elder vampires in Prague, a treatise written in 1612 by a scholar who had spent 40 years documenting the supernatural aristocracy of Central Europe. The treatise had mentioned, in a single paragraph that he had read so many times the page had worn soft at the edges, that a curse of this particular kind could be stabilized, not reversed, not cured, but held in suspension by the sustained presence of a reader. Not any reader. A reader with what the scholar called a gift of true voice. Someone whose reading carried genuine feeling. Someone who read not to perform, but to believe. The scholar had been uncertain about the mechanism. He had been very certain about the symptom. The vampire in question would feel the cold in his chest ease, would feel time, which had become a grinding weight, become briefly bearable. Edvard had felt at ease, for the first time in 3 years. And the woman who had caused it was Isolde Cresswell, daughter of the man who had once tried to have Edvard legally declared a fraud and stripped of his estate, a campaign that had failed, but had cost Edvard 2 years of considerable legal inconvenience. The daughter of his enemy, the woman he had met once briefly at a diplomatic reception in Vienna in 1867, when she had been 23 and had argued with him about whether the supernatural was a subject fit for rational inquiry, and he had been simultaneously charmed and alarmed, and had left the reception early rather than continue a conversation that was becoming dangerous in ways he could not easily explain. He had thought about her, occasionally, in the 11 years since. He had not expected her to arrive at his door. He came down from the East Wing the following evening, which was a thing he rarely did. Isolde was in the library, correcting her pupil's handwriting exercises. The pupil, a young woman of 25 named Miss Dorothea Hale, Edvard's ward, and the daughter of a deceased friend, had gone to bed. Isolde had stayed to finish the corrections by lamplight. She did not look up when he entered. "I wondered when you would come," she said. He stopped. "You knew I was there." The footprints in the corridor dust go in and not out. She set down her pen and looked at him across the library table. The lamplight caught the precise angle of her chin, and he had the disorienting experience of recognizing someone who had no business being in the same room as him. "Also, you left the door at the end of the corridor open last night. The first 3 nights it was closed. I assumed the change was deliberate." He sat down across from her, which was not what he had planned to do. He had planned to stand near the door and be authoritative. "Miss Cresswell," he said. "Lord Voss," she said, with a courtesy that contained very precisely no deference whatsoever. "You look somewhat better than when I saw you last, though that is not saying a great deal. You were not well even in Vienna." "I was perfectly well in Vienna." "You left a reception at 9 o'clock in the evening," she said, in the middle of a conversation, without explanation. "I had just asked you whether you believed the soul persisted after death, and you went very still, and then you were gone." She folded her hands on the table. "I have thought about that for 11 years. "I had an appointment," he said. "You are a very poor liar for someone who has presumably had a great deal of practice," she said. The cold in his chest shifted. Not warmed, acknowledged. "Why are you here?" he said. "At Thornmere, you were not trained as a governess." "My father lost everything 4 years ago," she said, without particular drama. "The estate, the investments, the London house. He died shortly after, which I am told was a mercy, though I found it rather a great deal of inconvenience on top of the existing inconvenience." She picked up her pen again and made a correction in the margin of Dorothea's exercise. "I am an educated woman with no income and no family. The options available to educated women with no income are somewhat limited. I chose the one that involved the most books." "I am sorry," he said, "about your father." She looked up. Something in her face considered him carefully. "He tried to have you prosecuted," she said. "I know that. He believed you had defrauded the Merchants' Exchange. He was wrong about that, but he believed it sincerely. He was not a wicked man. He was a frightened one." "I know," Edvard said. They sat in silence for a moment. The lamp made a small sound, settling. "I would like to continue reading in the East Wing," she said. "In the evenings after Dorothea is settled. I will not ask questions you don't wish to answer. I will not tell Mrs. Parfit or the other servants. I would like in exchange your assistance with a matter of some urgency." He was very still. "What matter?" "My father's solicitor, a man named Gregor Anstey, handled the dissolution of the estate," she said. "He told my father that the investments had failed, that there was nothing to recover, that the creditors had taken everything. I have recently come to believe that is not entirely true. I believe Anstey retained certain assets, a property in Derbyshire, several bond instruments, and recorded them as dissolved when they were in fact transferred to his own accounts. I have no legal standing to pursue this. I have no money for a solicitor of my own, but you have both. She met his eyes directly. I will read to you every night, as long as you require it. You will provide me with legal counsel and access to the records I need to prove what Anstey did. Those are my terms. He stared at her. He had not expected terms. He had expected, if he was honest, to be the one setting them. You know what I am, he said. Not a question. I know what you might be, she said. I have not yet decided whether I am certain. But I know that you have lived in a sealed wing for reasons that have nothing to do with eccentricity, that you have not been seen in daylight since the current staff was hired, and that the sound of a human voice reading appears to have a significant effect on your well-being. I am curious about the mechanism. I am not frightened of it. He thought of the treatise, of the scholar's careful, uncertain paragraph, of 3 years of the cold getting heavier. Agreed, he said. She nodded, as though they had settled the price of firewood. I will begin tonight if you like. She began that night, and every night thereafter, for 6 weeks. She read Grimm and then Anderson and then, at her own initiative, Dante, which she read in the original Italian with a fluency that surprised him, though it should not have. The reading was not performance. It was, as the scholar had described, genuine, the kind of reading that believed in the material, that found the weight in each sentence and let it rest where it belonged. The cold in Edvard's chest did not disappear, but it became manageable. He began, cautiously, to sleep. In the 7th week, Gregor Anstey arrived at Thornmere Hall uninvited. Edvard's solicitor, a sharp-minded man named Pemberton, who had been looking into the Cresswell estate records for 3 weeks, had sent a letter the previous Thursday indicating that he had found evidence of the fraudulent transfers Isolde had described. A property in Derbyshire registered to a shell company whose principals included Anstey's brother-in-law, and 3 bond instruments that had been marked dissolved in the official record but appeared in a private ledger under a different name. The letter had been intercepted. Edvard had not known this. He would learn it later. Anstey was a compact man of 55, with a solicitor's careful face and the particular self-assurance of someone who had spent decades doing wrong things in ways that were difficult to prove. He arrived in the afternoon, when Edvard was confined to the East Wing, and asked to speak with Miss Cresswell on a matter of business. Mrs. Parfitt, uncertain, showed him to the morning room. Isolde came down from the schoolroom where she had been reviewing Dorothea's botanical sketches. She recognized Anstey immediately. He had attended her father's funeral and wept with apparent sincerity. Miss Cresswell, he said, rising, I hope I find you well. I understand you have been making inquiries about your late father's estate. I have, she said. She sat down across from him and did not offer him tea. I am concerned, he said, that you may have been given inaccurate information by parties who do not fully understand the complexity of the transactions involved. I would hate for you to pursue a course of action that would prove both expensive and fruitless. He paused. And potentially damaging to your current employment. Lord Voss has a reputation to maintain. A governess embroiled in legal accusations against a respected solicitor would be a source of considerable embarrassment. Are you threatening my position? She said. I am offering perspective, he said. He leaned forward slightly. I am also prepared to offer you a settlement. A modest sum, enough to make your situation considerably more comfortable, in exchange for your agreement to discontinue the inquiry and sign a document confirming that the estate was properly dissolved. Isolde looked at him for a long moment. She was aware that she was alone in the morning room with a man who had stolen from her father and was now attempting to bribe her into silence, and that the servants were in the kitchen, and that Lord Voss was upstairs in a wing he could not leave until evening. How much? She said. Anstey named a figure. It was, in fact, enough to make her situation considerably more comfortable. No, she said. Miss Cresswell. The property in Derbyshire is worth 4 times that sum, she said. The bond instruments, compounded over 4 years, represent an additional significant amount. What you are offering me is a fraction of what was stolen, I am not interested in a fraction. She stood. I think you should leave. He stood as well, and the careful solicitor's face had shifted into something less careful. I think you should consider, he said, that Pemberton's letter to Lord Voss was not the only copy of that correspondence. I have the original, and I have friends on the Chancery Court who would find it very interesting to know that Lord Voss has been employing a solicitor to investigate a private citizen on the basis of accusations made by a disgraced baron's daughter with no legal standing. He picked up his hat. Lord Voss's own legal standing is somewhat complicated, I understand. A man who does not appear in daylight, who has no birth record that any living person can verify, who has maintained the same appearance for 30 years according to the oldest servants here. He smiled. Complicated. He left. The morning room felt smaller after he was gone. Isolde stood at the window and watched his carriage move down the drive, and she felt, for the first time since arriving at Thornmere, something that was not anger or determination, but simple fear. Anstey had not come to negotiate. He had come to assess what she had and to warn her that he was willing to use Edvard against her, which meant he would, if she pressed further, attempt to expose what Edvard was, which meant that continuing the inquiry put Edvard at risk. She had not, she realized, anticipated caring about that as much as she did. She went up to the East Wing that evening earlier than usual, before she had planned to read, and knocked on the door at the end of the corridor. "Come in," he said, which he had never said before. He had always simply been present when she arrived, standing near the window or sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace. She told him about Anstey's visit, all of it. She did not soften the part about his legal standing, or the part where Anstey had demonstrated that he knew enough to cause serious damage. Edvard listened without moving. When she finished, he said, "He intercepted Pemberton's letter." "Yes." "Which means he has been watching the inquiry for some time." "Yes." She sat down in the other chair, the one she had come to think of as hers, though she had never been invited to claim it. "He will go to the Chancery Court if I continue. He will make accusations about you. Not specific ones. He is too careful for that. But enough to create legal complications. Enough to make your situation untenable." "And if you stop?" Edvard said. "He keeps the property and the bonds. My father's estate remains dissolved. He walks away." She looked at the cold fireplace. "I need you to tell me something. Honestly. Ask. If he goes to Chancery with what he knows about you, what happens?" Edvard was quiet for a moment. "There are legal structures," he said carefully, "that can be used against individuals whose identity cannot be verified by conventional means. Declarations of fraud. Property seizure pending investigation. I have faced similar situations before, in other countries, under other names. It is manageable, but it is—" He paused. "It is not nothing. It would require me to move, to abandon this house, to begin again elsewhere." "As you have done before." "As I have done before," he agreed. She looked at him. He was sitting in the chair by the fireplace with his hands loose in his lap, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had been tired for a very long time and had become so accustomed to it that he no longer noticed. "I have a proposal," she said. "A different one from the original arrangement." "I'm listening," he said. "Anstey's leverage over you depends on his information remaining private," she said. "He has not gone to Chancery yet, because doing so would require him to explain how he obtained the information, which would raise questions about the intercepted letter, which would raise questions about his conduct in the estate dissolution. He is holding it as a threat, not a weapon. He wants me to stop, not to destroy you." She leaned forward. "But if I were to go to Chancery first? If I were to file a formal complaint against Anstey for the fraudulent transfers with Pemberton's evidence before Anstey can act, he loses the initiative. He becomes the defendant, not the accuser. Whatever he knows about you becomes his attempt to deflect from his own crimes." Edvard looked at her. "That requires you to file immediately." before he has time to move. Tomorrow morning, she said. Pemberton has the evidence. We have the ledger records. We go first. If it fails, if it fails, you lose the house and I lose the position, she said. But if we wait, he sets the terms. I would rather set them myself. He studied her. The lamplight was warm on her face, and she was looking at him with the same expression she had worn in Vienna when she had asked him whether the soul persisted after death, direct, unfrightened, genuinely curious about what he would say. There is something I should tell you, he said, before you decide. I know what you are, she said. You confirmed it 3 weeks ago when you told me the east wing faces west to avoid the morning sun. That is not what I was going to tell you. He looked at his hands. I was going to tell you that the reading, what you have been doing every evening, is not merely pleasant for me. It is necessary. The curse that makes me what I am has been unraveling for 3 years. Your voice, reading with genuine feeling, is the only thing that has slowed it. Without it, I would continue to diminish. Eventually, he stopped. Eventually you would die, she said. In a manner of speaking, he looked up. I should have told you this at the beginning. You negotiated a service without knowing its full value. That was not fair. She was quiet. The lamp settled again, its small domestic sound filling the pause. You are telling me now, she said, because you want to renegotiate. I am telling you now because you are about to take a significant risk on my behalf, and you deserve to know what you are risking it for. He met her eyes. You are not obligated to continue. The legal assistance is yours regardless. Pemberton will proceed whether or not you ever set foot in this wing again. I want you to know that. She thought about this for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had been a frightened man, and about Anstey, who was a calculating one, and about 11 years of a conversation that had ended without conclusion in a Viennese ballroom. She thought about the particular quality of the cold in this room, which was not unpleasant, which was simply the natural temperature of a man who had been alone for a very long time. I will continue to read, she said, not as a service, as a choice. She paused. But I have a new term. Name it. You stop leaving the East Wing and pretending you don't exist, she said. You come down to dinner. You speak to Dorothea, who is 25 years old, and has been living in this house for 2 years with a guardian who is a roomer. You be present. She held his gaze. That is what I want in exchange. Not money, not legal protection. Presence. He was still for a long moment. Then something in his face changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that old houses sometimes shift when a door that has been stuck for years finally opens. That is a great deal to ask, he said. I know, she said. I am asking it anyway. The next morning, Isolde dressed in her best gray dress, the one without the darned cuff, and took a hired carriage to Pemberton's offices in the market town 4 miles from Thornmere. Pemberton, a small, energetic man with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation, listened to her account of Anstey's visit, confirmed that the evidence was sufficient to support a formal complaint, and filed the necessary documents with the Chancery Court before noon. Anstey received notice that afternoon. He sent a letter to Thornmere Hall the following morning, addressed to Lord Voss, which was a miscalculation. Edvard read it, handed it to Isolde, and sent a reply through Pemberton indicating that any further communication regarding the matter should be directed to his legal counsel. Anstey's letter to the Chancery Court, which arrived 2 days later and contained carefully worded implications about Lord Voss's identity, was reviewed by a judge who found it substantially less compelling than the documented evidence of fraudulent asset transfers. The implications about Lord Voss were noted, investigated briefly, and determined to be unsupported by verifiable evidence. Anstey's attempt to redirect attention to his accuser had the effect of making him appear to the court as a man who was grasping. The hearing took 6 weeks. Isolde attended every session. She sat in the gallery with Pemberton's notes in her lap and watched the evidence she had assembled: the ledger records, the property registration, the bond instruments, laid out before the court with the methodical clarity that Pemberton brought to everything. Anstey's solicitor argued. The court considered. The property in Derbyshire and the bond instruments were ordered returned to the Cresswell estate, which meant, in practice, to Isolde. She sat in the carriage on the way back to Thornmere and felt something she had not felt in 4 years, which was the solid, unremarkable sensation of being right. That evening, she went to the east wing and knocked. "Come in," he said. She came in and sat in her chair and opened the Dante to where she had left off. She read for an hour. Then she closed the book. "It is done," she said. "The Derbyshire property is mine. The bonds will be transferred within the month." "I know," he said. "Pemberton sent word." "I will not need to be a governess much longer," she said. "I will have income of my own. I will be able to—" She stopped. She had not, until this moment, thought clearly about what came next. She had been so focused on the hearing, on Anstey, on the evidence, that she had not considered what she would do when the reason for being at Thornmere Hall no longer existed. "You could stay," he said. He said it quietly, without particular decoration, the way a person says a thing they have been holding for some time and have decided to simply put down. Not as governess, not in any capacity that requires a title. You could simply stay. She looked at him. He was sitting in his chair by the cold fireplace, and he looked, she thought, like someone who had just asked a question they were genuinely uncertain about the answer to, which was not an expression she had previously seen on his face. "You are asking me to stay because of the reading," she said. "I am asking you to stay because I have been thinking about a conversation that ended without conclusion in Vienna in 1867, he said. "And because you are the only person in 11 years who has sat in that chair and argued with me, and because the cold in my chest has been, for the first time in 3 years, bearable." He paused. "The reading is part of it. It is not all of it." She set the Dante on the side table. She looked at the cold fireplace, and then at him, and then at the window that faced west. "I have a condition," she said. "You always do," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "You answer the question," she said. He looked at her. "The one I asked in Vienna," she said. "Whether you believe the soul persists after death." She held his gaze. "You went still, and then you left. I have been waiting 11 years for the answer." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the night was fully settled, and the west-facing window held a deep, clear dark. "Yes," he said at last, "I believe it does. I have had more evidence than most people are given." He looked at her steadily. "I also believe that some souls find each other across a very great deal of time and inconvenience, and that this is not coincidence but something more stubborn than coincidence, something that does not give up." The lamp between them was burning low. She could feel the cold of the room, his particular cold, and it was not, as it had never been, frightening. It was simply the temperature of a very long life that had been, until recently, very lonely. She reached across and set her hand over his. His skin was cool and still, and after a moment his fingers turned and held hers, careful as a man handling something he has waited a long time to be trusted with. "I will stay," she said, "on the condition that you come down to dinner tomorrow." "That is a very small condition," he said. "I have already won the large ones," she said. "I can afford to be modest." He looked at her hand in his, and then at her face, and the expression on his face was the one she had glimpsed in Vienna for just a moment before he had gone very still and disappeared, open and careful, and quietly astonished. 3 months later, Dorothea Hale stood in the library doorway with a botanical sketch in her hand and watched her guardian sit at the library table across from the woman who had become, in some way that Dorothea found both obvious and difficult to articulate, the fixed point around which the house had reorganized itself. Lord Voss was reading something Isolde had written, notes toward a formal account of the Anstey proceedings, which she intended to submit to a legal journal under her own name. He had been reading it for 20 minutes and had made, so far, 4 corrections in the margins, each of which Isolde had argued about. "You are wrong about the precedent in the 3rd paragraph," Isolde said, not looking up from her own copy. "The 1849 case applies," he said. "The 1849 case was overturned in 1861, she said. "You would know that if you had been paying attention to English law in the intervening decades, instead of—" She paused. "Whatever it is you do instead." "I read," he said, "extensively. Clearly not the right things." Dorothea stepped quietly back from the doorway. She had grown up in this house as a ward, which was a polite way of saying she had grown up in a house where she was cared for but rarely noticed. She had been, for 2 years, the only warm presence in Thornmere Hall. She had not minded particularly, because she was a self-sufficient young woman with strong opinions about botanical illustration and a tendency to find human company exhausting in large doses. But she had noticed, in the past 3 months, that the house had changed, that there were voices in the evenings, that the east wing door stood open now most nights, and that the cold that had always pressed against the hall from that direction had become something more like the ordinary cool of an unheated corridor. That her guardian came to dinner and asked about her sketches and argued about legal precedent with a woman who argued back without apology. She went back to the schoolroom and finished her sketch of the night-blooming cereus she had been growing in the south window, a plant that flowered only in darkness, briefly, with an extravagance that seemed almost deliberate. She had been trying to capture it for weeks. Tonight, she thought she had it. Downstairs in the library, Isolde set down her pen and looked at the margin note Edvard had made in her 3rd paragraph. He was wrong about the 1849 case. She was certain of this. She was also certain that she would verify it in the morning with Pemberton's legal index, and that when she proved it she would tell him so directly, and that he would look at her with that particular expression, the one that was not quite a smile but contained something warmer than amusement, and say that she was very likely correct. She had spent 4 years believing that the things she had lost, the position, the house, the ease of a life that had not required her to be competent at everything simultaneously, was the whole of what mattered. She understood now that it had only been the scaffolding. The thing underneath, the part that was actually hers, had not been lost at all. It had simply been waiting, with the patience of something that did not give up, for her to stop mourning the scaffolding and notice it was still there. Edvard set the manuscript pages down and looked at the lamp between them, which was burning steadily, its light pooling warm across the table and across her hands, and across the open Dante that she had placed, as she always did, within reach, in case the evening called for it. "Read me something," he said. She picked up the Dante without looking at him, found her place, and began. Her voice was steady and clear and entirely without performance, and the cold in his chest, which would never entirely leave, which was simply part of what he was, settled into something that was not warmth, but was, at last, enough.